Dave Wilson wiped the black grease from his hands with an old rag as he walked down the long corridor of Coalition Station Aurora. His back ached from spending 12 hours crawling through tight access panels, fixing the environmental systems that kept everyone breathing. The station was huge, home to thousands of people from dozens of different alien species, but Dave knew every pipe, every wire, every circuit like the back of his hand. He had been working here for 3 years now, and in that time he had fixed everything from broken coffee makers to critical life support failures. His steel-toed work boots echoed on the metal floor as he hurried toward the station school. He was running late again. His shift had gone long because one of the air recyclers had decided to malfunction right at the end of the day. But Dave never complained. This job paid the bills and let him be there for his daughter, and that was all that mattered. Amy was waiting outside the school entrance, sitting on a bench with her backpack covered in hand-drawn pictures of spaceships. She was 8 years old, with brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail and her mother's warm eyes. When she saw her dad, she jumped up and ran to him. "Dad. You're late again," she said, but she was smiling as she grabbed his hand. "I know, sweetheart. Sorry." The recycler in Section 7 had other plans, Dave replied, squeezing her small hand. "How was school?" "Good. We learned about different alien homeworlds today. Did you know that the Ventari people can see colors we can't even imagine?" Dave smiled as they walked together toward the residential section of the station. These moments were everything to him. After losing his wife Rachel 2 years ago in a terrible shuttle accident, Amy had become his entire world. He worked hard to give her a stable life, even if it meant long hours and tired muscles. They were passing by the mess hall when Dave heard loud laughter coming from inside. The evening crowd had gathered, and the place was packed with off-duty personnel grabbing dinner. Dave wouldn't have paid any attention except he distinctly heard someone say his name. "Wilson the wrench turner," a booming voice called out, dripping with mockery. Dave stopped walking. Amy looked up at him, confused. The voice belonged to Commander Valtar, a high-ranking officer from the Rigelian species. The Rigelians had blue-tinted skin and stood almost 7 feet tall. They had joined the coalition only 6 months ago, and from day one, they had made it clear that they thought humans were only good for manual labor. Commander Valtar was the worst of them, constantly looking down on anyone he considered beneath his rank. "Perhaps we should let Wilson pilot the Vanguard tomorrow," Valtar continued, his voice echoing through the mess hall. "I'm absolutely certain his expertise with fixing toilets translates perfectly to flying our most advanced prototype spacecraft." The table full of Rigelian officers exploded with laughter. They slapped the table with their large hands, some of them nearly falling out of their chairs from laughing so hard. Other species in the mess hall looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Valtar was a commander after all. Dave felt Amy's hand tighten in his. She looked up at him with worried eyes. "Dad, those men are being mean," she whispered. Dave took a slow breath. He could feel dozens of eyes turning toward him now. People had noticed he was standing right outside the mess hall entrance. They were waiting to see what he would do. Would he walk away? Would he get angry? The smart thing would be to ignore it and keep walking. Valtar was just trying to get a reaction. But something shifted inside Dave at that moment. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working double shifts. Maybe it was the memory of all the small insults and dismissive looks he had endured over the past few months. Maybe it was the fact that his daughter was watching, learning how to respond when people tried to make you feel small. Dave walked calmly into the mess hall, still holding Amy's hand. The room gradually fell silent as people realized what was happening. He approached Commander Valtar's table with steady steps, his expression neutral. Valtar looked up, surprised to see the maintenance worker standing right in front of him. The Rigelian's smile was smug, expecting Dave to either complain or make a scene. "I accept," Dave said simply. His voice was quiet but clear. The laughter died instantly. Commander Valtar's smile froze on his face. "What?" Valtar said, clearly not understanding. "Your offer. I'll pilot the Vanguard for tomorrow's test flight." "I accept." You could have heard a pin drop in that mess hall. Someone at a nearby table actually dropped their fork, and it clattered loudly on the plate. Everyone stared at Dave like he had lost his mind. The Vanguard was the most advanced experimental ship the Coalition had ever built. It combined technology from 7 different alien species. The test flights were dangerous, complicated, and required years of specialized training. Commander Valtar's expression cycled through several emotions. First confusion, then amusement, then something that looked almost like panic. He had been making a joke, a cruel one meant to humiliate the human maintenance worker in front of everyone. But now, with dozens of witnesses from multiple species watching, he was trapped. If he backed down now he would look weak. The Rigelian culture placed enormous value on bold declarations and following through on challenges. To take back his words would be deeply shameful. Valtar straightened in his chair, trying to regain his composure. His fellow officers watched him nervously. Very well, Valtar said slowly, forcing his smile to return. I'll authorize it. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. Don't be late, Wrench Turner. His officers laughed again, but it sounded forced this time, uncertain. Dave simply nodded once, turned around and walked out of the mess hall with Amy. As they stepped back into the corridor, Amy tugged on his sleeve. Dad, do you really know how to fly spaceships? She asked, her voice small and worried. Dave stopped and knelt down so he was eye level with his daughter. He put his hands on her shoulders gently. I used to, sweetheart. A long time ago before you were born, he said honestly. Before Mom died? Even before that. But that was a different life, Amy. A different version of me. Amy studied her father's face carefully, the way kids do when they're trying to understand something important. Are you scared? Dave thought about it. A little, he admitted. But sometimes you have to stand up when people try to push you down. Even if it's scary. Amy wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. I think you can do it. You can fix anything. Dave held his daughter close for a moment, then stood up and took her hand again. They walked toward their quarters in the residential section, a small two-room space that Dave kept neat and comfortable. As he made spaghetti for dinner, his mind kept drifting to a part of his past he had deliberately left behind. Before Amy was born, Dave Wilson had been Lieutenant Commander Dave Wilson. He had been one of Earth's elite test pilots, flying experimental spacecraft that most people would never have the courage to even sit in. He had logged over 200 successful test flights in prototypes that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. Some of those ships had killed other pilots. Dave had brought them home. But when Amy was born, everything changed. He wanted to be there for her, to be present in a way his own father never had been. So he resigned his commission and took a regular job. When Rachel died 2 years ago, Dave chose the maintenance position specifically because it was stable, grounded, and safe. He never talked about his past because it didn't matter anymore. His identity was Amy's dad, and that was enough. Now, apparently, that old life was coming back whether he was ready or not. Across the station in the command center, Admiral Pierce sat at her desk reviewing the day's reports. She was a veteran officer who had been with the coalition for 20 years. When a message came through about the incident in the mess hall, she pulled up Dave Wilson's personnel file on her private terminal. She read through it carefully, her expression gradually shifting to a knowing smile. Oh, Valtar, she said quietly to herself. You have absolutely no idea what you just did. The hangar bay was already buzzing with activity when Dave arrived at 7 in the morning, a full hour before the scheduled test flight. He wore his standard maintenance coveralls, the same dark blue uniform with grease stains that he wore every day. Over his shoulder he carried his old tool bag, the leather worn smooth from years of use. It felt strange walking into the hangar as a pilot instead of a mechanic, but Dave kept his expression calm and focused. Amy walked beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly. She wore her favorite jacket, the one with patches of different planets on the sleeves. Admiral Pierce had personally arranged for Amy to watch from the observation deck, and the girl was practically vibrating with excitement and nerves. They stopped at the entrance to the observation deck. Dave knelt down and pulled his daughter into a hug. Kick butt, Dad, Amy whispered into his ear. Dave pulled back and gave her a mock-serious look. Language, young lady. Amy giggled despite her nervousness. You always say that. Because it's always true, Dave replied, tapping her nose gently. Now go on up there. Admiral Pierce will take care of you. I love you, kiddo. Love you too, Dad. Be careful. Dave watched her disappear up the stairs to the observation deck, then turned and walked into the main hangar. The space was enormous, big enough to hold 6 large spacecraft, but right now all attention was focused on the ship sitting in the center like a sleeping predator. The Vanguard was absolutely beautiful. She was sleek and dangerous looking, with smooth curves that reflected the overhead lights. Her hull was a deep metallic gray that shifted colors slightly depending on the angle. The ship represented the best engineering from 7 different alien species, all working together. Dave had spent 3 years maintaining her systems, crawling through her access tunnels, rewiring her circuits when they failed. He knew every inch of this ship, every quirk and personality trait she had developed. Commander Valtar stood near the ship with a group of his Rigelian officers. The commander looked like he had slept poorly, with dark circles under his eyes and his uniform not quite as crisp as usual. Nearby stood Lieutenant Hayes, the actual test pilot who had been scheduled for today's flight. Hayes was a skilled pilot in his 30s with short red hair and a frustrated expression. He clearly was not happy about being bumped from his scheduled flight. Dave approached the group calmly. Valtar saw him coming and straightened up, trying to look confident. "Wilson," Valtar said, his voice stiff and formal. "We need to review your qualifications for the official flight record." "Of course, Commander. Whatever you need," Dave replied politely. Captain Reed, one of Valtar's junior officers, was already standing at a computer terminal near the ship. He pulled up the station's personnel database and typed in Dave's name. The file began loading on the screen. Reed's eyes went wide almost immediately. His mouth opened slightly in shock. "Sir," Reed said urgently, "you really need to see this." Commander Valtar walked over, annoyed at the interruption. He leaned in to read the screen, and Dave watched as the color drained from the alien's blue-tinted face. Valtar's confident expression crumbled into something between shock and horror. Other officers gathered around the terminal, reading over their commander's shoulder. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the hangar like wildfire. Dave's personnel file told a story that no one on the station had known. Before Amy was born, Dave Wilson had not been a maintenance worker. He had been Lieutenant Commander Dave Wilson, one of Earth's most elite test pilots. The file showed an impressive record that most pilots could only dream of. 247 successful test flights in experimental spacecraft. 73 emergency situations successfully resolved. Multiple commendations for exceptional skill under pressure and innovative problem-solving in critical scenarios. The file went deeper. Dave had flown prototypes that had killed other pilots before him. He had brought back ships that everyone else said were unrecoverable. He had logged more flight hours in untested, dangerous spacecraft than most career pilots would see in their entire lives. His instructors had described him as having an almost supernatural ability to understand how a ship would behave before it actually did it. There were notes about specific incidents. A fuel system failure at 8,000 meters that Dave had solved by manually rerouting power while inverted. An electrical fire in the cockpit that he had extinguished while still maintaining controlled flight. A catastrophic navigation failure that Dave had overcome by flying manually using only visual references and mathematical calculations he did in his head. Commander Valtar stared at the screen for what felt like forever. When he finally looked up at Dave, his expression had completely changed. "Why?" Valtar started, then had to clear his throat. "Why are you working as a maintenance mechanic?" Dave glanced up toward the observation deck. Through the reinforced glass, he could see Amy's small figure pressed against the window, watching everything. Other children from the station school had gathered around her, along with their parents and teachers. Word had spread fast about the mechanic who had accepted the joke challenge. "Because my daughter needed a father who came home every night," Dave said simply. "When you're a test pilot, every flight might be your last. I didn't want Amy growing up without a parent, so I chose a different path. Simple as that." The hangar had grown very quiet. Personnel who had been working on other ships had stopped to listen. Mechanics, engineers, security officers, and administrative staff all stood still, watching this conversation unfold. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward, his anger from earlier completely gone. "You gave up test flying to be a dad?" "I didn't give it up," Dave corrected gently. "I chose something more important. There's a difference." Admiral Pierce's voice crackled through the hangar's communication system. "Wilson, you're cleared for pre-flight checks whenever you're ready. Take your time and do it right." Dave nodded to himself and walked toward the Vanguard. As he approached, his entire demeanor shifted subtly. His shoulders straightened. His movements became more precise and confident. This was muscle memory from another life, a version of himself that he had put away but never truly forgotten. He climbed the access ladder and entered the cockpit. The seat welcomed him like an old friend. The controls spread out before him in a complex array that would overwhelm most people, but Dave's eyes tracked across them with practiced ease. His hands began the pre-flight sequence, moving across switches and buttons with the kind of fluid precision that only comes from doing something thousands of times. Each movement was deliberate and efficient. Check the primary power systems. Verify the backup generators. Test the flight control surfaces. Confirm navigation systems online. Review life support redundancies. The checklist was long and detailed, but Dave moved through it like a concert pianist playing a familiar piece. In the command center high above the hangar, Admiral Pierce watched the monitors showing the Vanguard systems coming online. Lieutenant Hayes stood beside her, no longer angry, now just fascinated. "Did you know about his background?" Hayes asked quietly. Admiral Pierce smiled without taking her eyes off the monitors. I read every personnel file on this station, Lieutenant. I've known about Dave Wilson since the day he applied for the maintenance position. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to give him a reason to show what he really is. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you tell him to fly? Because he made his choice, Pierce replied. He chose his daughter over glory. That kind of integrity is rare, Lieutenant. You don't pressure someone who's made that kind of sacrifice. But you also don't forget what they're capable of. I knew eventually the universe would give him a reason to fly again. I just didn't expect it to be because of Valter's stupidity. Back in the hangar, Commander Valtar stood frozen, watching Dave work. The other Regelian officers gathered around him, talking in low, urgent voices. They all understood now that their commander had made a catastrophic mistake. He had not challenged a simple mechanic. He had challenged a legend who had chosen to live quietly. On the observation deck, Amy pressed her face so close to the glass that her breath fogged it up. She had to keep wiping it clear with her sleeve. Other children crowded around her, asking questions. Is that really your dad? Is he actually going to fly it? Were those stories true? Was he really a famous pilot? Amy just nodded, unable to speak because her throat was tight with emotion. She had always known her dad was special, but now everyone else was seeing it too. Dave finished the pre-flight checklist and sat back in the pilot's seat. He took a slow, deep breath, his hands resting lightly on the controls. It had been years, but this felt right. The Vanguard felt right. Like coming home to a place you thought you had lost forever. Control, this is Vanguard, Dave said into the comm system, his voice steady and professional. Pre-flight sequence complete. All systems showing green across the board. Requesting clearance for departure. Admiral Pierce's voice came back immediately, and Dave could hear the smile in it. Vanguard, you are cleared for departure. Show us what she can do. Retry. The Vanguard's engines hummed to life with a deep, powerful sound that Dave felt in his chest. The ship lifted off the hangar floor smoothly, hovering for just a moment as the landing gear retracted with precise mechanical clicks. Then, with the gentlest push on the controls, Dave guided her forward through the massive hangar doors and out into the endless black of space. The transition was seamless. One moment the ship was surrounded by the artificial lights and enclosed walls of the station, and the next, stars filled every window. Dave felt something unlock inside his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. This was freedom. This was home. Control, Vanguard is clear of the station. Beginning acceleration test sequence, Dave reported, his voice calm and measured. Back in the command center, dozens of monitors displayed every possible reading from the ship. Admiral Pierce stood at the center, her hands clasped behind her back, watching with keen interest. Lieutenant Hayes was at a nearby console, tracking the telemetry data as it streamed in. The standard test protocol was straightforward but important. Dave needed to gradually increase the ship's speed in controlled increments, holding each level for 30 seconds while the sensors gathered data about how the engines performed. It was methodical, careful work that required precision timing and smooth control. Dave executed each step perfectly. His hands moved across the controls with an ease that made it look effortless, but Lieutenant Hayes could see the complexity in what Dave was doing. He was not just following the checklist mechanically. He was feeling the ship, making tiny adjustments before the computer even registered that adjustments were needed. When the ship drifted slightly to port, Dave corrected it so smoothly that the movement barely registered on the sensors. His reaction time is incredible, Hayes muttered, leaning closer to his screen. Look at this. He's compensating for drift patterns before they even fully develop. He's reading the ship like he can predict what it's going to do. Admiral Pierce nodded but said nothing. She had seen this before years ago, when Dave Wilson's name was spoken with reverence in Earth's military academies. Dave moved through the basic test sequence with mechanical precision. Each acceleration level was held for exactly 30 seconds. Each deceleration was smooth and controlled. The data quality was exceptional because his flying was so stable. Usually, test flights had small variations and wobbles that muddied the sensor readings, but Dave's control was so precise that the data came through crystal clear. 20 minutes after starting, Dave completed the entire basic checklist. It normally took test pilots 30 to 35 minutes, but Dave had done it faster while somehow gathering better quality data. Control, basic test sequence complete. All systems performing within expected parameters. Engines are running smooth, Dave reported. There was a pause. Admiral Pierce looked at the monitors, then made a decision. Vanguard, your basic sequence is complete and your performance has been outstanding, Pierce said. I'm authorizing an extension to the test protocol if you're willing. We'd like to see what the Vanguard can really do. This is completely optional, Wilson. It's your call. Inside the cockpit, Dave looked out at the field of stars stretching in every direction. He had forgotten how much he missed this. The feeling of a powerful ship responding to his commands. The challenge of pushing systems to their limits. The pure joy of flight. His hands rested on the controls, and he could feel the Vanguard's potential humming beneath his fingertips, waiting to be unleashed. Control, permission granted. Let's see what she's got, Dave replied. What happened next became instant legend on Coalition Station Aurora. Dave took the Vanguard through a sequence of maneuvers that left experienced pilots speechless. He started with a precision barrel roll, spinning the entire ship along its central axis while maintaining exact velocity. The computer model said this was theoretically possible, but no pilot had ever successfully demonstrated it because it required perfect control. The slightest variation would cause the ship to either speed up or slow down. Dave executed it flawlessly, the ship rotating like it was on an invisible axis. Lieutenant Hayes stood up from his console, staring at the data. That's not possible. How is he doing that? Dave transitioned immediately into the next maneuver. He initiated an emergency power transfer, simulating what would happen if the primary generator failed and backup systems needed to take over. Normally, pilots did this exercise while flying straight and level because it was complicated and dangerous. Dave did it while pulling a tight turn that put 4 gs of force on the ship's frame. The power transfer completed without a single flicker, and the turn was perfect. On the observation deck, Amy jumped up and down, cheering. That's my dad. That's my dad. The other children around her stared in awe, and several adults had gathered behind them, watching the monitors that showed the Vanguard's flight path. Dave performed a simulated docking approach next, coming in at speeds that would terrify most pilots. Docking was normally done slowly and carefully, but emergency situations sometimes required fast docks. Dave brought the Vanguard screaming in toward a virtual marker, his hands dancing across the controls, and touched the target point with less than 1 centimeter of deviation. It was surgical precision at dangerous speeds. But this was not reckless showboating. Every single maneuver Dave performed had a purpose. He was testing the Vanguard's capabilities systematically, gathering data that the engineers desperately needed. He pushed the ship hard but never beyond what he knew it could handle. He combined his pilot instincts with his detailed mechanical knowledge of the ship's systems. He knew exactly how much stress each component could take because he had maintained and repaired those components himself. Commander Valtar watched from the hangar on a monitor, his face unreadable. His officers stood silently around him. There was nothing to say. They were watching a master at work. Then the emergency alarm cut through everything. A panicked voice burst across all communication channels. Mayday, mayday. This is Cargo Transport Bennett. We have total engine failure. Repeat, total engine failure. We're drifting and cannot control our trajectory. Admiral Pierce's expression went hard. She pulled up the tracking data immediately. The Bennett was a small independent cargo hauler operated by a family of traders. And according to the trajectory calculations, it was drifting directly toward the station on a collision course. All ships, respond if you can intercept, Pierce commanded, her voice sharp. Control, this is Vanguard. I'm the closest ship and I have the speed to reach them. Dave's voice was absolutely calm, like he was discussing the weather. I can be there in 3 minutes. Requesting emergency clearance to intercept. Admiral Pierce did not hesitate for even a second. Clearance granted, Vanguard. Bring them home, Dave. Dave's hands moved across the controls in a blur. The Vanguard's engines flared bright blue as he changed course sharply, pushing the ship harder than the test protocols allowed. But this was not a test anymore. This was real. Lives were at stake. The cargo transport Bennett tumbled through space like a leaf in the wind. It was a boxy, ungainly ship that hauled containers between stations. Right now, with its engines completely dead, it was 23 tons of spinning metal drifting toward the station at a speed that would destroy both the ship and the station if it hit. Inside were 5 crew members, all from the same family. Dave approached fast, his mind calculating vectors and intercept angles with the kind of rapid-fire processing that came from years of experience. He could see the Bennett spinning on his view screen, tumbling end over end. The ship's rotation made this exponentially more difficult. He could not just grab it. He had to match its movement first. Control, I'm going to attempt an unconventional intercept, Dave said. Trust me on this. He brought the Vanguard alongside the tumbling hauler, close enough that he could see the individual panels on its hull. Then he did something that made everyone watching hold their breath. He matched the Bennett's spin, rotating his own ship in the same pattern. The Vanguard spun in perfect synchronization with the cargo hauler, like two dancers moving together. Dave activated the tractor beam emitters. These were experimental systems designed for controlled cargo operations, not emergency rescues. The standard procedure would be to use a steady beam to gradually slow the target. But Dave knew these systems intimately because he had installed and repaired them himself. He knew what they were really capable of beyond what the safety specifications claimed. He used the tractor beams and pulses instead of a steady stream, hitting the Bennett with rhythmic bursts of force that acted like brakes without tearing the hull apart. At the same time, he fired his own maneuvering thrusters in precise counter patterns, using the Vanguard's mass as a counterweight to slow the Bennett's rotation. It was incredibly complex. Dave was flying his ship in a spin while simultaneously pulsing the tractor beams in a specific rhythm while firing thrusters in a calculated pattern, all while constantly adjusting for the changing dynamics as the Bennett gradually slowed. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands never stopped moving, never hesitated. 4 minutes of intense concentration. For minutes where one mistake would kill 5 people and possibly damage the station. For minutes where Dave Wilson proved exactly why he had been considered one of the best. The Bennett's spin slowed gradually, then stopped completely. The ship hung in space, stable and secure in the Vanguard's tractor beam. Control, target is stabilized and secure. Beginning tow back to station, Dave reported. His voice was steady, but inside the cockpit he finally let out a long breath. The command center erupted in cheers. Dave guided both ships back toward Coalition Station Aurora with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the entire flight. The Vanguard moved slowly now, gently towing the disabled Bennett like a parent helping a struggling child. Every movement was deliberate and controlled. He brought the cargo hauler into an emergency docking bay first, settling it down with such a gentle touch that the landing barely registered on the sensors. Then he piloted the Vanguard back to her original hangar, powering down each system methodically and carefully. When the cockpit canopy finally opened and Dave stood up, his legs were slightly shaky from the adrenaline wearing off. He climbed down the access ladder slowly, and as his boots touched the hangar floor, he realized the massive space had filled with people. Mechanics still in their work coveralls. Officers in their crisp uniforms. Civilian staff from administrative offices. Engineers with tablet computers still in their hands. Security personnel who had abandoned their posts to see this moment. Everyone who had heard what happened had come. The crowd stood in complete silence as Dave reached the ground. Then, like thunder building in the distance, the applause started. It began with one person clapping, then 2, then 5, then suddenly the entire hangar was filled with the sound of hundreds of hands coming together. The noise was overwhelming, echoing off the metal walls and high ceiling. Dave stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, not sure what to do with his hands. He had just done his job. He had seen people who needed help and he had helped them. It did not feel like something that deserved this kind of response. Then Amy broke through the crowd like a small missile. She had run down from the observation deck, her feet pounding on the stairs, and now she sprinted across the hangar floor with tears streaming down her face. Dave saw her coming and dropped to one knee just as she crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his neck so tightly he could barely breathe. "You saved them, Dad. You saved those people." Amy sobbed into his shoulder, her whole body shaking with emotion and relief. Dave held his daughter close, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other arm wrapped firmly around her small back. This moment, right here, his little girl safe in his arms, meant more to him than any medal or recognition ever could. This was why he flew. This was why he had accepted the challenge. To show his daughter that when people try to make you feel small, you stand up. And when people need help, you help them. The applause continued, but Dave barely heard it anymore. He was focused entirely on Amy, whispering to her that everything was okay, that he was fine, that he would always come home to her. Across the hangar, the emergency bay doors opened and the Bennett's crew emerged. They moved slowly, still shaky from their near-death experience. Captain Janitor led them, a weathered woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her 3 adult children followed her, along with her husband Martin. Behind them, 2 young boys, maybe 6 and 9 years old, held hands as they walked. Medical personnel tried to check them over, but Captain Torres waved them off impatiently. Her eyes scanned the hangar until they locked onto Dave. She strode across the floor with determined steps, her family following behind her. People moved out of her way automatically. Dave stood up, setting Amy down but keeping her close. He watched Captain Torres approach, not sure what to expect. Captain Torres stopped directly in front of him. For a moment she just stared at him, her eyes red and glassy. Then she grabbed his hand with both of hers, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You saved our lives," she said, her voice rough and thick with emotion. "Our engines died completely. We had no control, no way to stop. We were going to hit the station. We were all going to die." Her voice cracked. "My grandchildren were on that ship." She gestured behind her to the two young boys, who watched with wide, frightened eyes. They were her son's children, traveling with the family on what was supposed to be a routine cargo run. Dave felt his throat tighten. He understood that fear intimately, the terror of possibly losing a child. He looked at those two boys and thought about Amy, about what it would mean to lose her. "You're safe now," Dave said quietly, squeezing her hand back. "That's all that matters. You and your family are safe." Captain Torres's husband stepped forward and put his hand on Dave's shoulder. "We owe you everything. If there's ever anything we can do, anything at all, you just say the word." Dave shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Captain Torres said firmly. "You did. You risked your life to save people you didn't even know." Before Dave could respond, Admiral Pierce's voice cut through the hangar. "Attention. All personnel form up." The crowd immediately began organizing itself with military efficiency. Officers straightened their uniforms. Enlisted personnel found their proper positions. Civilians moved to the sides of the hangar. Commander Valtar and his Regelian officers stood in a stiff line off to one side, their expressions unreadable. Admiral Pierce descended the stairs from the command center, her footsteps echoing in the now quiet hangar. She was a commanding presence, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had seen combat, lost friends, made hard decisions. She walked with the confidence of someone who had earned every bit of authority she held. She stopped in the center of the hangar and turned to address the assembled crowd. Her voice carried clearly without needing amplification. "Yesterday, a joke was made at the expense of one of our crew members," Pierce began, her tone formal but with an edge of steel underneath. "Commander Valtar suggested that Maintenance Chief Dave Wilson should pilot the Vanguard, implying that his skills as a mechanic made him unqualified for anything more challenging." She paused, letting that sink in. Today that joke was answered. Chief Wilson not only demonstrated exceptional piloting skills, he used those skills to save 5 lives in an emergency situation that would have challenged even our most experienced pilots. She turned to face Dave directly. "The Coalition owes you a debt of gratitude, Chief Wilson. You exemplified the best of what we stand for. Courage under pressure, quick thinking in crisis situations, and the willingness to put others before yourself." The hangar remained absolutely silent. Admiral Pierce then turned to face Commander Valtar, and her expression hardened. "However, there is a matter that must be addressed," she continued, her voice dropping to something colder. "Commander Valtar, your behavior yesterday was unbecoming of an officer in the Coalition forces. You demonstrated disrespect to a member of this station based solely on his job title, without any consideration for his actual capabilities or his worth as an individual. That kind of prejudice is unacceptable." Valtar's jaw tightened, but he remained at attention, unable to respond. "Your joke could have had serious consequences," Pierce went on. "If Chief Wilson had been less skilled, or if he had refused your challenge and we had needed the Vanguard during today's emergency, lives could have been lost. Your careless mockery put people at risk." She paused. "Consider this an official reprimand. It will be noted in your permanent record. Respect is earned through character and competence, Commander, not through species membership or rank. I expect significantly better from you going forward." The public nature of this discipline was unusual and deliberate. Admiral Pierce was making a point that everyone needed to hear. The Regelian officers shifted uncomfortably, but Valtar stood perfectly still, taking his punishment without protest. Pierce turned back to Dave. "Chief Wilson, I'm offering you the position of lead test pilot for the Vanguard program. Full rank restoration to Lieutenant Commander, with appropriate pay grade and benefits. You've proven beyond any doubt that you're the best person for this job." The hangar held its collective breath. This was a huge offer, the kind of position that pilots dreamed about their entire careers. Amy looked up at her father, her eyes wide. Dave looked down at his daughter, then back at Admiral Pierce. He took a breath. "Admiral, I appreciate that offer more than I can possibly express," Dave said carefully, choosing his words. "But I left test piloting for a very specific reason. My daughter needs a father who comes home every night, not someone who's constantly risking his life on dangerous flights." He saw Amy's face fall slightly and squeezed her shoulder. "However, I'd like to propose a compromise if you're willing to hear it." Pierce raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on. Let me consult on the program instead of flying full-time. I can train your pilots, combining flight knowledge with mechanical expertise. I can help troubleshoot systems from both perspectives, pilot and engineer. I can refine procedures and improve safety protocols." He paused. "But I need to do it on a schedule that lets me still be a dad first and a pilot second. That way the program gets the benefit of my experience without requiring me to choose between my career and my daughter." Retry. 3 months passed and Coalition Station Aurora transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. The changes started small, like ripples spreading across still water, but they touched every corner of the massive station. Dave's mornings now followed a new routine. He still woke up early, still made breakfast for Amy, still walked her to school. But instead of heading straight to the maintenance bay afterward, he split his time between two worlds. Some days he wore his old coveralls and fixed broken systems with his wrench and diagnostic tools. Other days he wore a flight suit and stood in the simulator room, teaching pilots how to truly understand their ships. The Vanguard program had been completely revolutionized by Dave's involvement. He brought a perspective that none of the engineers or pilots had considered before. He understood ships not just as machines to be flown, but as complex systems where every part affected every other part. When a pilot complained about sluggish response in the lateral thrusters, Dave did not just tell them how to compensate. He took them down to the engine room and showed them exactly why the thrusters responded that way, explained the fuel flow dynamics, demonstrated how temperature affected performance. The pilots learned to feel their ships differently, to understand the why behind every behavior. Lieutenant Hayes had become Dave's star pupil. The young pilot now ran the day-to-day test flights, but he flew with a completely different approach than before. He spent time in the maintenance bay before every flight, checking systems himself, talking to the mechanics about any recent repairs or adjustments. His flight reports became more detailed and useful because he understood what information the engineers actually needed. His emergency response times improved dramatically because he knew exactly what his backup systems could handle. On Tuesday evenings, Dave ran a special training session that had become legendary on the station. He called it Wrenches and Wings, and the concept was simple but revolutionary. Pilots worked alongside mechanics, learning to repair and maintain the ships they flew. Mechanics sat in simulators, learning basic flight principles and emergency procedures. Everyone learned to see their jobs from a different perspective. The program had started with just Lieutenant Hayes and 3 curious mechanics. Now it drew 25 participants every week, with a waiting list of people eager to join. The training room buzzed with activity as a Ventari pilot carefully rewired a control panel under the guidance of a human mechanic, while nearby, 2 Regelian maintenance workers practiced emergency landing procedures in the simulator. Commander Valtar attended every single session, and his transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The proud officer who had mocked Dave 3 months ago was now one of his most dedicated students. Valtar arrived early, stayed late, and asked endless questions. He learned to run diagnostic tests, repair basic systems, and understand the intricate relationship between a ship's components. His flying improved noticeably as his mechanical knowledge grew deeper. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, Valtar approached Dave as people were packing up their tools and shutting down simulators. "Wilson," Valtar said, his voice quiet. "May I speak with you?" Dave looked up from the control panel he was reassembling. "Of course, Commander. What's on your mind?" Valtar was silent for a moment, clearly struggling with something. Finally he spoke. "I wanted to thank you. For teaching me. For not holding my behavior against me." He paused. "I was arrogant. I judged you and all humans based on nothing but prejudice and pride. I thought understanding machines was beneath an officer. I was wrong about everything." Dave set down his tools and gave Valtar his full attention. "We all make mistakes, Commander. What matters is what we do after we realize we're wrong. You've put in the work. You've changed. That takes courage." "You could have humiliated me," Valtar continued. "After what I did, you had every right to make me look foolish. Instead you treated me with respect and patience. Why?" Dave considered the question carefully. "Because holding grudges doesn't fix anything. You made a mistake born from ignorance, not genuine cruelty. And when you realized you were wrong, you had the strength to admit it and change. That's rare, Commander. That's worth respecting." Valtar nodded slowly, then extended his hand in the human gesture of respect he had learned. Dave shook it firmly. The changes spread beyond just the training programs. Throughout the station, the way different species interacted with each other had shifted. Regellian officers who had previously dismissed human workers now stopped to ask their opinions on technical problems. Human mechanics found themselves invited to planning meetings where their practical knowledge proved invaluable. The invisible walls between different job titles and species began crumbling. Admiral Pierce watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. In her weekly reports to Coalition Command, she detailed how the cross-training program had improved efficiency, reduced equipment failures, and boosted morale across every department. She sent Dave's training curriculum to other stations with enthusiastic recommendations. Before long, similar programs started appearing throughout the Coalition. They called it the Wilson Protocol, and it became shorthand for integrated training that broke down barriers between specializations. Dave found the whole thing slightly embarrassing. "I just taught people about ships," he told Admiral Pierce when she showed him reports of other stations adopting his methods. "I didn't invent anything revolutionary." "You reminded us that excellence doesn't come from titles or species membership," Pierce replied. "In a coalition of dozens of different cultures, all trying to figure out how to work together, that's more revolutionary than you realize." The Torres family had become a regular part of Dave and Amy's life. True to their word, Captain Torres insisted on bringing dinner to the Wilson quarters once a week. It became a cherished tradition. The family would arrive with homemade food from their home world's recipes, and they would all crowd into Dave's small quarters, sharing stories and laughter. Janet's two grandsons, Bobby and William, idolized Dave completely. They followed him around the station whenever they visited, asking endless questions about ships and flying and what it was like to be a hero. "I'm not a hero," Dave always told them. "I just did what needed doing." But Amy would shake her head and smile, knowing better. Amy herself had flourished over these 3 months. The shy girl who had once walked quietly beside her father now had friends from half a dozen different species. She attended school with renewed confidence, her hand shooting up to answer questions, her laugh ringing out during recess. Other children treated her with a mixture of awe and genuine friendship. She was Dave's daughter, yes, but she was also just Amy, a smart and kind girl who loved drawing spaceships and helping her dad fix things. On a Friday evening, as the station's artificial sunset painted the observation deck in orange and gold, Dave and Amy sat in their favorite spot by the massive windows. Below them, the Vanguard was being prepared for an evening test flight. Tonight's pilot was Lieutenant Reed, the young Regellian officer who had pulled up Dave's personnel file that first day. Reed had trained hard under Dave's guidance, absorbing everything he could learn. He had earned this flight through dedication and skill. "Do you miss it, Dad?" Amy asked, watching the pre-flight preparations below. "Being out there flying?" Dave was quiet for a moment, looking at his daughter's reflection in the window. He had learned to be honest with her about complicated feelings. "Sometimes," he admitted, "flying is special. There's nothing else quite like it. The freedom, the challenge, the beauty of it." He put his arm around her shoulders. "But being your dad is the most important thing I'll ever do. And I wouldn't trade that for anything in the universe. Not even for flying the Vanguard every day? Not even for that." Amy leaned against his side, comfortable and secure. "I'm glad you're my dad." "I'm glad you're my daughter," Dave replied, kissing the top of her head. They watched together as the Vanguard powered up, its engines glowing bright blue in the dim hangar. Lieutenant Reed's flight path appeared on the tracking screens mounted near the observation windows. His launch was smooth and confident, his trajectory perfect. Dave had taught him well. As they stood to head home for dinner, they passed by the station's main bulletin board in the central corridor. Someone had posted a handwritten quote that had become Aurora's unofficial motto over the past 3 months. The paper was slightly worn now, the edges curled from so many people stopping to read it. "Excellence isn't about the uniform you wear or the title you hold. It's about showing up, doing the work, and caring about what matters." Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added a second line. "The mechanic taught us that." Amy read it again even though she had memorized it weeks ago. She looked up at her father with pride shining in her eyes. "That's about you, Dad?" Dave shook his head gently. "That's about everyone, sweetheart. It's about doing your best no matter what job you have. It's about treating people with respect. It's about remembering that everyone has value, regardless of their title or species." He squeezed her hand. "That's not special. That's just being a decent person." But as they walked through corridors where Regellian officers now laughed and worked alongside human mechanics, where species that had once barely spoken now collaborated on complex problems, where job titles mattered less than competence and character, it was clear that what Dave Wilson considered just being decent, had transformed an entire community. In her private office, Admiral Pierce was composing her final report of the quarter. She wrote, "The Wilson incident has demonstrated a fundamental principle that should guide all coalition operations. Never underestimate someone based on their current position. A mechanic can be a master pilot. A pilot can learn invaluable lessons from maintenance workers. When we create environments where people can share knowledge across traditional boundaries, everyone benefits. Respect and collaboration make us stronger than any hierarchy ever could. If the coalition is going to truly succeed, we must remember that excellence appears in unexpected places. Our job is to recognize it, nurture it, and give it space to flourish." She paused, then added one final line. "Dave Wilson didn't just save 5 lives 3 months ago. He reminded us how to see each other clearly. That might be the more important rescue." Outside, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. But on Coalition Station Aurora, humans and aliens worked side by side, learned from each other, and built something better together. All because a single dad mechanic had accepted a cruel joke with quiet dignity, and proved that the greatest strength isn't in putting others down, but in lifting everyone up. The Vanguard streaked across the viewport, a bright point of light against the darkness, piloted by someone Dave had trained. Amy waved at it even though the pilot could not see her, and Dave smiled, his arm around his daughter's shoulders, exactly where he belonged.